pentagram dedicated to Henry Foreman. In the years of the primal force and the dawn of terrestrial birth, man mastered the mammoth and horse, and man was the lord of the earth. He made him an hollow skin from the heart of an holy tree. He compassed the earth therein, and man was the lord of the sea. He controlled the vigor of steam. He harnessed the lightning for hire. He drove the celestial team, and man was the lord of the fire. Deep mouths from their thrones.
Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to episode 41 of Agitators Anonymous. I am Alan Averill. I haven't said it in a while because it seems almost obsolete, but I am the singer of a band called Primordial and a few other bits and musical pieces. In case you somehow have stumbled upon my podcast and not known who I am or who I was, well, here we are, episode 41. It's time for me, my friends, to start collecting some debts. And I don't really want to, but, well, we'll leave them for a while and let's see what happens. But certainly, if you've been following the podcast or binging back through the episodes, you'll find that I pretty much predicted is maybe not the right word. I suppose my natural inclination towards crushing pessimism and negativity, well, some of the time, informed my decision or my opinion that we were going to be pretty much in the position where we are in relation to the situation, the emergency, as they would say in the past here. And it is now coming up on almost a year. And indeed, the people who sort of mocked or laughed my pessimism at the situation, maybe in the summer, who I made a few little bets with, well, it's now time to pay up. Because we're approaching, I suppose, a line in the sand for me was Patrick's Day, March the 17th. We missed it last year. Never meant a hell of a lot to me, but, you know, the small country sitting in the middle of the Atlantic had inspired this massive celebration throughout the world. Whether you approved of its stereotypical example of Irish drunken hedonism or not, don't culturally appropriate us, don't you know? Well, the line in the sand was next Paddy's Day, and slowly it approaches. Though people I had bets on about January, February, March, and all the way through the summer. So, looks like I'm going to have a few more euros to not be able to spend on anything. As we in Ireland here are in level 5 of lockdown. I think this makes us at least in the top 5, perhaps the top 1 or 2 countries that have spent the longest time in lockdown. So maybe we can compile some sort of top 10 of that in a decade. Maybe we've dropped down to 6th or 7th in 2038 or something like this. Anyway. I hope you enjoyed the interview, the last episode with Anton from Pentagram. Of course, I spelt his name, or rather I said his name incorrectly in the first moment I introduced him. Reisenegger, not Reisiger. I don't know what I was doing with that. But Anton was a very interesting guest, and if you haven't listened to that one, you should go back and look at it on the video cast, talking about life under Chile's Pinochet and growing up under a dictatorship, which I thought was a pretty prescient conversation to have, considering some of the things that may or may not be happening right now. If you want to follow me on Patreon and support the show, it's patreon.com/Alan Averill with 2 capital A's. I do bonus podcasts, there's demos, other songs, this, that, and the other. All sorts of things. So go over there if you wish to support me and the show. Well, so this episode is going to be a bit of a ramble. I'm going to try and tackle a little bit of the Great Reset because I notice it's literally everywhere now. Everybody is discussing it. And it's something I was aware of half a year ago, 8-9 months ago already. And I've sort of watched it bloom, the conversation about it bloom, or at least the fruit, the low-hanging rotten fruit now is being able to be picked by people. And I'm going to try and hold the line between what I see as the more extreme elements of either side that view it, whether they are conspiracy theory people on one side or the people who utterly dismiss it on the other. The truth most probably lies somewhere in the middle, as I feel most things do, within the grey area between the black and white opinions of the world, because that's where most things are. And on this example, on this situation, I think that's also where some of the truth is. So it's not going to be the most complicated dissection of all of the aims, all of the terms of the reset. It's going to be for maybe a little look at what's surrounding the noise on either side, why we tend to believe what we believe, how we've become so fractured as a society, that kind of thing. But firstly, a few things. Please, stop sending me pictures of gigs in New Zealand. I know. Well done, New Zealand. But last week I was inundated with so many pictures of shows in New Zealand. I know what people were trying to do. They were trying to sort of G me up a little bit, cheer me up a little bit. And I do appreciate that. But I do have to say, unfortunately, to hold a little pin to your bubble, that New Zealand is probably the most geographically isolated country in the world. And so comparing New Zealand to, for example, a Europe of 457 million people, is it? Or 447, with 32 member states and however many borders and airports and people flying in and out. I mean, look, it's not really comparable. I understand what people were trying to do, and fair enough, I appreciate that. Ireland, of course, could have maybe tried to do something a little similar, but then we would need a time machine to go back to the beginning of this. And the fact that we only really asked people who were landing in Ireland, do they or don't they have a negative test in the last 3-4 weeks, seems to me to be a little bit insane. Why you wouldn't have asked that months and months and months ago, I don't know. However, here we are. Please stop sending me pictures of gigs in New Zealand, especially when the leaders here in Ireland are making noises, dropping media clangers or media signposts, or whatever you want to call it. There's a little bit of saber rattling going on, I suppose, when our leader sort of says, oh, be careful what you wish for, or you'll be in a form of this until next Christmas. And of course, people then lose their minds about that. So we veer back and forward between being scared by the intentions of our elected elite to hold us in this position for 6, 9, 12 months, perhaps indefinitely, that's going to be a discussion I'm going to come to, or we get angry at our own people for their own indiscretions. And yes, some of them deserved, and others not, because if you put it in the context of people having literally no life for the last 12 months, well, you can understand that people are at breaking point. Certainly in my own life, this has been one of the most difficult months to cope with. January in Ireland is a particularly gloomy, depressing month. It's generally very rainy, very grey, lots of swirling winds sweeping through the city. It's certainly not a beautiful winter month, and it's certainly, if you're living in the Antipodes or something where you're going through your summer months, if I haven't been incorrect in saying that, enjoy them, because a little bit of sunshine might make this all a little bit easier. But no, Dublin is a grey month to be dealing with all of this in a January, and it's been a particularly gloomy one because I think people are just sort of broken with an endless cycle of bad news. And part of that is clear that in a post-Trump world, to gain clicks for the media, they're going to have to think up new ways to move clickbait, to move marketing, to move numbers. And certainly, if it bleeds, it leads, is part of the traditional media mantra, i.e. disaster journalism or disaster stories or disastrous predictions are things that move more headlines, move more papers, put more eyes on whatever it is they're trying to sell. So in that sense, the media and the state are in this endless cycle of predicting misery. And I think it's really, really, really worn people down. And also, you know, as a musician, when you hear things like your politicians saying that, well, be careful what you wish for, or you'll have some sort of mandatory quarantine and elements of lockdown for another, you know, for talking about the whole rest of the year, well, then it's clear then, of course, you won't have any gigs. You won't have any shows of any kind. No, I understand that most people, as I said before, couldn't really give a shit about the arts. It's pretty clear that that is very, very true. Statements like that make you realize that it's not even a consideration, that all of the things that were in our budget here, which were a sop to the arts to kind of let it seem like anyone gave a shit about it, mean pretty much nothing. And that unless we move backwards out of lockdown, then none of these things happen. But I know you're tired of me saying the same things, a bit bored of me going over the same tropes. And, you know, I am too. I'm bored of banging the drum. It's kind of like... A taxi driver said to me, he goes, "You now live under communist country, you know this." His voice is a little bit higher than Victor, my other alter ego. "You now live in communist country. I cannot believe Ireland people behave like this." I said, "Where are you from?" "Romania." I said, a country I've been in many, many times. "Yeah, I live there, you know. I grew up under Ceausescu, the bastard." I said, "Yeah, he was quite the bastard, wasn't he?" And he goes, "And now we're living again in communist country. But even in communist country, we were able to have a beer, you know." And I said, "Yes, my friend. I don't know what to tell you, because every time I step or sit in a cab with a taxi driver of Eastern European or Middle Eastern origin, they say more or less the same thing to me. They say, these are part of the reasons why we came to your country to get away from. And here we are, and you guys have almost welcomed many of the same rules." Now, I understand, as I've been talking about many times before, for Irish people, that will sit uneasily with them because they don't really observe things like this. As I've said many times on the podcast before, is that it can not only be a health crisis, but also a civil liberties crisis, or a crisis of sovereignty, of freedoms, of all of these things. It can be both things at the same time. The idea that they're mutually exclusive, that one can only argue from the position of hospital beds being taken up and not listen to a concern about civil liberty, is incongruous to me. You can be concerned about both. And as I said before, the fact that I talk about more of the things, obviously, that interest me on the podcast, which are the liberties, freedoms, all of the geopolitics, that's what interests me. If I was doing a podcast on nursing, for example, then I'm sure it would, focus on some of the things that are happening in the nursing sector right now. But I don't. I do a podcast called Agitators Anonymous. It's kind of implied in the name. Anyway, so my taxi driver, he says to me, "I do not see any way out of this." And we were joking, and he was joking about the fact that he maybe will return to Romania. He observed that he feels that maybe in 9 or 12 months, Romania might be a freer place to be. He's said to me he saved up. I said, "I've saved some money in Ireland, He's becoming a little bit non-Eastern there in the accent. But he was saying that his intention now is maybe to go back to Eastern Europe, because if this is the way Ireland has set out its stall, that he can't live like this. And I understood what he meant, because once you have set out your stall like this to deal with a situation, then how do you ever not deal with another situation in the same way? For example, another strain, another variant, all of these things. How do you not do the same thing? Because then that would seem inhumane on some level, because you've set out your stall to deal with this in the beginning. So I should do a little first ad read, which is for Hate Couture, www.hatcouture616.com. Hateful yet tasteful apparel and clothing, all sorts of nasty things there. The veneration of tyrants and the veneration of serial killers and all sorts of stuff like this that will upset your nearest and dearest. And if you use the promo code AA Podcast, you'll get free shipping. And I know quite a few people who've ordered things from them and have been, quite morbidly delighted with their purchases. Let's try and discuss a few more serious things. Now, as I said, you've probably noticed that there's a lot of talk about this great reset. And either side I get the impression that either side of the debate, one is maybe not taking it seriously enough, and another side is taking it too seriously. Now, why is that? I mean, let's discuss before we get into some of the details of it. Like I said, this is not going to be a history lesson on what's been happening in Davos, which is a small town in Switzerland, by the way. Then this year marks the 50th anniversary of the World Economic Forum's meeting there. A place where I suppose the 1%, we could call them, or, industry movers, leaders of state, leaders of country, technological innovators, industrialists, all these kind of people meet. And you can pay to sit in the crowd and listen. In fact, it's happening right now, and there are on YouTube Zoom videos of some of their conference calls. So the idea first off the bat that it's a conspiracy theory, I think is obviously wrong, because it's very much out there in the open. They have their own YouTube channel. You just put in the Great Reset and you get the World Economic Forum, and they're explaining their ideals. And some of them sound incredibly altruistic and benign. Their website is sort of like a breezy, it feels like almost like an advertisement for some yoga hub or something. It's very bright and breezy, full of smiling, happy people and pop-ups of this and that. And it gives very little detail, very little meat, very little information on something that theoretically could impact every single person on the planet. So you think there might be some more meat to the bones, or at least some debate or argument of the processes for normal people who might read this, but there isn't really. It's, like I said, it's like signing up for the yoga hub around the corner to go and do hot yoga and, some slam poetry following. It's very bright and breezy, which of course adds fuel and fire to both sides of the argument. And that's one of the things I want to sort of think about before I go a little bit further. And that is the idea that our trust in institutions has been almost completely destroyed. Now, why is that? I've said this on the podcast several times. I think we're at the end of a 10-year cycle of social media derangement. We've become unhinged, deranged from our shared observations of society, our shared observations of even truth. Everything has become objective. We can see we've been shown on the news footage of cities burning and people standing in front telling us, well, nothing to see here, nothing happening, peaceful protest, etc. Just as an example off the top of my head. And there are many from either side. The idea that we have a shared truth, that once upon a time we sat down maybe with the family and watched the news, and the news was impartial to a point, is completely gone. We're all absolutely played by our algorithm, whether we like it or not. And so therefore, if you keep everybody inside for a whole year, is it really surprising that the middle ground of their objectivity, of their rationality, of their reason becomes utterly destroyed, or almost completely destroyed? And I feel it even within myself, as somebody who prizes rationality and reason over emotional observations of situations. It's been very hard to hold the line when every day is almost like Groundhog Day, where you are isolated, where you are kept inside, which, by the way, seems to contravene elements of the Geneva Convention on Human Rights. But however, that's another thing altogether. When you have no other contact with people other than what you have at the end of a screen, of course the algorithm forces you into channels and corrals your anger and outrage and isolation and feelings of anxiety and fear into these small cesspools whereby your confirmation bias is just regurgitated towards you. I see it in my own algorithm, the things that it suggests to me. I know that I will go down a YouTube wormhole and end up being more angry than I was before, and also feeling more helpless and hopeless than before. So therefore, the idea that, and people have to realize this, is that an awful lot of people believe in angels. Plenty of people believe in angels. Plenty of people believe in things that are absolutely unscientific, that we know to be unscientific truths, but they believe them. They're the things they believe. They're believies, whatever you want to call it. And the idea that the newly formed, let's call it academic intellectual arm of modern society, who I think reside mostly on the left, but not only, who view the working class essentially with contempt, this divide has given rise to elements of populism in modern society, and that's one of the things I want to try and get at and lever at, is the idea that the populism that was displayed, that got a person like, a circus entertainer like Trump where he was, is partially, or almost, well, maybe not partially, maybe greater than partially, dependent on this schism in modern society, this idea that we have no shared truths, or we have no shared vision of society. And so the populism rushes in to fill the gaps, the god of the gaps, as they say. And so therefore, something like the Great Reset, which comes along, is almost perfect for either side to jump on and say, look, this is the example of all of the things that are happening. And the other side goes, pah, it's just nonsense. Because of the fact that the words themselves, conspiracy theory, what does that mean? I mean, what does conspiracy theory mean? The idea that thousands of people could, for example, keep the truth about a moon landing quiet for 50 years. Could that be real? And then someone doing only research at the end of a screen could find the truth. I think that one of the problems with all of this is that a globalist plot would require so many working parts that the mind boggles. Is that even possible? I don't really think it is. So the idea that there are venture capitalists, or let's call them disaster capitalists, who are not benefiting from this. I mean, it's clear that a massive transfer of wealth has been moving towards the 1% of people. They have made an incredible amount of money out of this lockdown, out of this situation, and will continue to do so. And for someone like me who is concerned with issues like freedom and liberty, the idea that it's only a cash grab would set me more at ease, because that's what it was in 2008 with the refinancing of the banks and all that kind of thing. The idea that it's only that would be somehow comforting on some level. Now, as I said, this podcast is going to be a bit rambling, a bit all over the place, because that's where my mind is at the moment. Trying to be particularly focused and have some, complex scripts written to explain all this kind of thing is just sort of beyond my mental state at the moment. So you'll have to accept that this is just a prime slice of Averill ramble, and not to forget that I'm a singer in a heavy metal band, whatever else. So the thing about it is that to expect people to have not jumped ship from the middle ground and embraced either side of this polarized debate, if you lock them down for 12 months and give them no access to conversations outside of those that they have on a screen, it's hardly surprising, really, that we believe in some of the further fringes of this debate. So where does that leave something like the Great Reset? Well, I mean, you can do your own research into who they are, where it's from, but the main guy is called Klaus Schwab. He's an 83-year-old German industrialist. And this is the 50th anniversary of his little shindig in the mountains of Switzerland. And like I said, you can easily find their website, their YouTube page, and some of it looks perfectly fine to me. Some, of course. And so therefore the idea on some elements of, I suppose, the left of journalism, that this is a conspiracy theory, I don't think really makes sense, because the idea of a conspiracy theory itself is that something, I suppose, that is fundamentally hidden. Well, it certainly isn't. And on face value, to be reasonable, it suggests the model of outlaw capitalism is unsustainable for a world where the population has increased threefold in 90 years. I don't think we could argue about that. How influential it is overplayed by some, underplayed by others. And again, I consider the grey area to probably be where most people reside. But you can see they are an unelected elite, an unelected group of people who are deciding the fate, or are purported to be deciding the fate of millions of people. But there are just so many things that just feel to me like not reading the room, so to speak. So if you take something like, go and look at the videos of the Great Reset, and you'll find you're being lectured by Prince Charles. Prince Charles. the prince, Machiavelli, the prince, indeed. But the monarchy lecturing working class or normal people about how their lives will be is just such an example of not being able to read the room of modern society. By reading the room, I mean judging the temperature of the public. Because what that is essentially saying is, oh, do you mind if we return you to the feudal serfdom of the 16th century or something like this, where the monarchy was, king. The monarchy ruled all. I mean, it's such an incredibly strange thing to be lectured by for, normal people in their hundreds of millions who are going to be affected by this, for 42 million jobless people in the USA who are in this position because of lockdown, to then read the terms of the reset, who are saying this represents a great opportunity to reset this, that, and the other. And you're kind of going, okay, so you have the monarchy lecturing tens of millions of people who are newly unemployed about what a great opportunity this is. And it cannot help but break your brain in two, because it's such an incredible disconnect. But how could it be any different in 2021, in 2020? We live in a world where we no longer are able to sense make, where we don't really know what is fake, what is real, what is wherever or whatever. And how can we if all we're doing is sitting inside in front of a screen? So our second ad read is metalblade.com. If you're in North America, use the promo code AA Podcast and you will get 10% off. Simple as that. You can order the new Dread Sovereign album. You can order the back catalogue of Primordial and many, many other heavy metal luminaries from the last 40 years. Yep, check it out. Do that. The problem is, of course, that right now in all of our member states, they're dealing or fumbling in the dark through a health crisis, which seems at least to give people little leadership, or there are no lines in the sand which say when we get to this percentage of this, then we move backwards to give you your freedom, or we move back through the gears of lockdown. There's so little, let's call it mathematical leadership, in the sense that there are no numbers involved in here's the moment where you return to this element of the life that you had before. And in that lack of leadership, let's call it, of course things rush in to fill the vacuum. And so for people who are conspiracy theorists, what the Great Reset is hiding is, well, or rather not hiding because it's out in plain sight, is the idea of biometric health passports linked to your travel, that somehow lockdown will just not end, that it will just continuously roll and move into an environmental lockdown, which will be linked to a carbon footprint, basically a form of imposed remote living. And it will be issued to us under the terms of an environmental crisis. Now, that seems rather extreme, but then you listen to the rhetoric of many politicians. You can watch on YouTube Greta Thunberg lecturing the people of the World Economic Forum, and you think to yourself, well, could there be some truth in that? Could this just end up being an endless rolling lockdown? And certainly the people who didn't believe so in the first month or two when it happened are now beginning to join the conversation after a year. Could that be possible? That this morphs into an environmental lockdown? Of course, observationally, locking down Ireland's carbon footprint, if you want to say that, is nothing compared to the industry in India or China or whatever else. And so fixing the problem by locking down the whole of Denmark, in the grand scheme of things for the world, doesn't really do very much, I suppose, at least to me. But what we have definitely seen is a pause in democracy, a suspension of civil liberty in order to implement measures of health and safety. So the idea is, do the public accept that they have less freedom but more safety? They discuss the fourth revolution, which again has been written about for a couple of years. And this is the coming of automation and AI. And of course, if you link these things together, if automation is going to take many, many working class jobs, wouldn't you place all those people on a form of universal basic income? So then you begin to connect the dots with that to your own situation. And then it becomes a little bit more, well, less conspiratorial, but pretty dark on some level. It feels like that to me, because essentially then you're moving into the idea where they say, and they openly say on their forum, they say, you will own nothing and you will be happy. Almost like an order that you will be happy and you will own nothing. So the idea that then you connect the dots and you think to yourself, well, okay, so how can we keep endlessly furloughing these small businesses? Like in Ireland, they're just endlessly furloughing these small businesses. And where is this money coming from, and how is it paid back? And then maybe logically you think to yourself, oh, okay, when they do open or open with the restrictions, then there will be maybe some sort of debt forgiveness on the furlough money, which will allow the relinquishing of property rights. And this is where it all gets a bit squirrely, because you will own nothing is a statement of the Great Reset. And obviously property rights are one of the most important things that we've built our modern civilization on. From the moment indentured slaves worked off their slavery in the North Americas and rose to the role of politician, rose through the ranks of politics. The idea that you owned, man was the king of his castle, so to speak. The owning of property was one of the things that kept us rooted against the terms of, I suppose, serfdom, a form of slavery. Because, and let's be kind of clear here now, and I hope I'm not being a little bit over dramatic, but every great tyranny begins with the confiscation of land, whether it's the pogroms, Jewish pogroms in Russia by the Bolsheviks, to the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. This is how it begins, which is the confiscation of land and property. So, of course, this is going to set off alarm bells, naturally. Because the idea that if you own nothing, it's also quite a Marxist idea, which you can see reflected in the language of, for example, the Antifa, abolish all property. So then, of course, this is absolutely ripe for people to connect the dots and go, oh, is this a Marxist insurrection of modern society? Now, I don't believe that. I don't believe that. I do believe that there is obviously an economy there to be made, a disaster capitalism that is running amok through all of this. But at the same time, that a statement like, you will own nothing and you will be happy, should send some form of shivers down the spine of people. But yet at the same, I keep saying the same time, but at the same time, if the terms of this reset are to be believed in their fullest capacity, what this essentially means is that, at least how I see it, is that the history of your nation state ceases to mean anything anymore. That small business that you worked for 50 years is gone, to be replaced by state-owned apparatus. That your history, your language, your culture, your folklore are going to take a severe, there's going to be severe challenges, because for me as a musician, comedy, theatre, gigs don't happen until lockdown goes back to zero. So if it doesn't go back to zero, then what do we get? Do we just get a form of those, state-promoted North Korean style operas or musicals for the public to enjoy? State-sanctioned art? Obviously, I'm taking it to its dark conclusion, but is that really where it goes? So how can this be reflected all throughout Europe? How could you basically lock interminably up 457 million people and ask them to forget the previous life they had, to accept health and safety over democracy and civil liberties, to basically a form of remote living that is sold to them under the guise of environmentalism? Again, these are huge, huge questions. And watching the YouTube videos of the Great Reset on their channel, they aren't really explained. They're really, their channels, their videos are them talking amongst themselves. They're not really addressing you or I. And that's what's very confusing about the idea, about it all. So maybe that's partly what it is. It partly is theatre. It's part of a small bit of psychodrama between a bunch of very influential people. Then there's a few handshakes and deals done afterwards. And at the end of the wish list, you get a few things that you wished for, but mostly you don't. And life goes back to a variation of what it was before. Is it a kind of more form of benign theatre than some people are considering? It's entirely possible. But it certainly embraces a sort of confusing voyeurism that's sort of dressed up in holistic self-help language that really doesn't answer any of the questions your average person has. But maybe it's not supposed to. Maybe it's just a smart bit of window dressing. Could be those things as well, right? As what's clear to me is that part of the populism that got a figure like Trump elected is going to rush in to fill the gap, to oppose these sort of these rules and regulations, setting Western society up for potentially some form of massive conflict. Because the idea that you can sort of set out all of these rules and regulations in countries or an entire continent that has had such incredible history with conflict and war and internecine struggles, and then say to them, okay, by the way, this is how the world is now. In a year, we've turned it on its head. The idea that that can just somehow be imposed on hundreds of millions of people and also have their jobs removed from them by AI and automation will break your brain trying to consider, how could that be possible? How can you tell the entire country of Italy, oh, by the way, all of your traditions are now, well, they're on the way to obsolescence, and not expect some pushback? So therefore, is it just a talking shop? So you can see how things are quite ripe for people to, when they've been inside their houses for a year with no end into that in sight, you can see, reading this literature, watching these YouTube videos, and the fact that they're so out in the open, and then they look outside and go, well, this does kind of look like how it looks. But then from the other side of things, as I try and hold the line between this, let's examine something else. The Great Reset is the latest in edition of a tradition, a Davos tradition. So you have Shaping the Post-Crisis World, 2009, Rethink, Redesign, Rebuild, 2010, The Great Transformation, 2012, Creating a Shared Future in a Fractured World, 2018. So you kind of get the idea, okay, so this is sort of the Davos smoke and mirrors. They do this every time there is some great problem in society. They rush to try and fill the gap with their new technological ideas and their hawkish ideas of, I suppose, a form of venture capitalism. So is this just their latest blockbuster? Is this just their Die Hard 5 or Die Hard 6? It certainly follows in a tradition of grand and great statements or great installments, no doubt. But then you will read articles, for example, in The Guardian or something, calling the whole idea just complete implausible rubbish. Which I think is, again, a step too far in the other direction. It's clear that this is to influence to influence a post-pandemic world and rebuild it, restructure it. How much of it is just a talking shop of ideas? It's very hard to say. But one thing is for sure, as I said, it's an unelected group of people who are making even theoretical decisions that impact you that, let's be clear, won't impact them. So the entire mess is brain-breaking and confusing. And that's not your fault or my fault. Like I said, I'm not into conspiracy theory generally. I think that the truth is grey, and it always will be. I think that there are forms of singular human agency that can alter the direction of history that no one can foresee, whether it's, the driver of Archduke Ferdinand not being able to speak the same language and not understanding where to take him, and driving back down the hill to allow Gabriella Princip another shot at Archduke Ferdinand. These small moments can shape history. So the idea that there is a huge umbrella of a global cabal manipulating everything is just too much for me to reconcile with, because I think there are just too many moving parts. Mathematically, to me, it doesn't make sense. Now, that is not to say there are massive agents of power and influence who can shift and move things, and clearly are. And then, as I said, the idea that you look outside and go, oh, well, we've been isolated from each other for 12 months. The idea that this is only a health crisis would seem to me to be a little bit naive, because surely, of course, in the wake of every crisis, there are people who take advantage of it. There are people who gain from it. And it's clear that that's also happening now. So there are so many people screaming into the void of trying to understand what the reset is. Now, I'm not going to, as I said, go through all the details of who the people are, the years, the this, the that, the other. You can go and look it up online, who has attended, and you'll probably find your own prime ministers have. Members of the biggest multinationals from your country or state have been there. And also Bono from U2 has been there. I'm a bit disappointed I haven't been asked this year. Could have given my keynote address, or, talked about speed metal from Columbia from 1985 or something. But the idea that it is benign, which some people have written about, I think cannot be true because of the level of wealth that is there, the level of power that is there, that even if only 5% or 1% of the things they consider happen and they affect normal people, well, that is non-benign. So there is a kind of offhand dismissal by elements of this sort of academic or journalistic left, let's call them sometimes, maybe not the left, and because like I said, those terms mean little to me anymore. How I understood the old left and the old right don't really make sense in a modern landscape anymore. I think they're just almost completely arbitrary. But there's certainly an attempt by educated elements of society to just dismiss all of this as just conspiracy theory and to file it under QAnon and all of these other crazy things. But that does this a disservice. I think that does this an intellectual disservice, and I think it's just more sort of pandering in a way to a form of anti-Trump rhetoric. The idea that, well, if any of the people who supported him believe any of this stuff, none of it can be right. But Epstein had an island, right? And this brings me to the third ad read, which is Lamentations of the Flame Princess. www.lotfp.com. These are RPG, role-playing game books, if you're into that kind of thing. Really incredibly well produced, incredible detail. The artwork is amazing. There's elements of traditional heavy metal storylines through them. Guest authors, guest artists, really very impressive. I don't play RPGs, but maybe you do. If you do, go to www.lotfp.com, and if you buy 3 books, you'll get 2 extra ones free from the choice of the authors. Use the promo code Alan. It would seem that 42 million Americans have are claiming unemployment or unemployed now. How can this set a stable future for this reset ideal? Surely it just represents a smoke and mirrors talk shop so that this 1% can be seen to be doing something of worth in an open and transparent way, to have your best interests at heart. But then Biden has been campaigning under slogans of the Great Reset. Build Back Better, for example. John Kerry, who is working under the Biden administration, has openly discussed the Great Reset. So, again, this makes it even more confusing. You have commentators from both sides screaming about the importance and the non-importance of the reset. But why all of a sudden is it getting so much traction? And that's kind of more what I'm trying to talk about. And that's because people are deranged. They've gone mad. They're looking for, they're being funneled into these cesspools of ideology because they're being locked down all the time, because they're taking in so much information every day. They have no outlet for it. They have no outlet for their energy. They have no, they've nothing else in their lives very often other than to be maneuvered into corralled into these pens of thought, because that is what their lives are right now. And then you begin to try, and it's not hard to put two and two together and get this four and think to yourself, wow, it doesn't end, because this lockdown or this forms of this benefit the people who are sitting in that room. And then, of course, you realize, you connect dots and go, okay, well, the keynote speaker was from the CCP last year, and there's the Chinese social currency system, which is a real thing. And couldn't our own leaders aspire to want that across the Western world? And then all of a sudden you fall into the ravine of biometrics, health passports, which again are a thing. So you're connecting all these dots, and it ends up making you feel outraged, insane, helpless, hopeless, and kind of trapped. So inevitably people end up being funneled into the furthest reaches of either side to either reject it outright or claim that, go full lizard on it. But like I said, the truth is probably in the middle. But the mainstream media's unwillingness to maybe write critical articles about it or to scrutinize it a bit more is also dangerous. All sorts of dangerous ideas are lurking within it. This reckless push towards automation in the middle of a joblessness crisis is insane. The fact that so many people are losing their jobs. How has someone like Bill Gates come to define our global health policy? These could be questions that could be asked of a mainstream media. But the problem is, of course, that very real objectives have now been blended with the furthest reaches of conspiracy theory on either side. So what's happened is that serious constructive analysis of what this represents in relation to the situation that we all find ourselves in our specific, wherever it is that you're living, wherever you're from, a very specific analysis of what all of these things represents seems impossible, because no one is willing to be associated with or being tarred with the brush of being a conspiracy theorist. So you're not going to read, for example, in our media here, a critical analysis of the implications of long-term lockdown in relation to civil liberties and freedoms and sovereignties generally, because it's deemed as inhumane. Nor are you going to read a big in-depth analysis of, for example, the Great Reset, where our own leaders have visited. You're not going to read a really deep analysis of it in the mainstream media, because it's so hard to grapple with and understand, but also because everyone is so afraid of being tarred with the brush of being connected to either the alt-right or QAnon or anything like this. So in this God of the gaps, which is a phrase meaning that, we invented God to fill in the gaps of our understanding of science and technology, of science back in the day. In this sort of moral God of the gaps, this form of isolated outrage has filled in the gaps. And that is part of the problem, is that our ability throughout this whole situation, we're at the tail end of a 10-year derangement cycle of social media, which I think has destroyed our ability to err on the side of rationality and hold the middle ground. And then you just pour on top of that the last year, where people have been asked to just stay inside and absorb way too much information, negative information, all of these theories. And it's hardly surprising that we have lost our ability to sense make. Because how can we? Because the very nature of our human process has been interrupted. The idea that humans as social animals could be just kept apart from each other, isolated through fear, anger, outrage, helplessness, hopelessness, and therefore not be expected to turn their attention, their anger, their outrage to theories such as this is nonsensical. Of course they were going to, but it makes no sense to consider that they wouldn't. So the idea from one side that you can look down on people for being siphoned into going full on with this, thinking that this is the implementation of a global prison state whereby every movement is controlled and micromanaged. It's hardly surprising people think that, because there's an element of where we are that does look like that. But there also, on the other side, is an element that doesn't, that just feels like a fumbling in the dark of a broken system that has implemented a botched response and is trying to do its best to fumble through that. And this is what really defines an awful lot of my podcasts, or an awful lot of my thoughts about this, and definitely this podcast. And that is the cognitive dissonance involved in living in the modern world, but also the idea that many different points of view, many different things can be true at the same time, and they aren't mutually exclusive. And that's mind-bending, trying to figure out the percentages of what is malign and what is benign, because it's almost impossible to know from where we sit at the end of a screen. So that's the most confusing and complex thing, is that everything right now looks like everything at the same time. And it's brain breaking. And while we don't have any other distractions, even the distraction of, this may sound banal, but the gym, keeping fit, playing sports, while we have no distractions of any kind, it's hardly surprising that people have been siphoned off to either side. Like I said, go and do a little bit of research yourself into Davos, into the Great Reset, into who the people are, who the people have gone there, and you will find it very easily. Analyze what you think of their own bright and breezy, as I said, yoga website, which will tell you that you will be happy and own nothing. It also states things like they want to go to Mars, and some other really cryptic things like, sort of insinuations that European values will be challenged. Why don't you know what that means? Quite. In fact, all of it is so ambiguous. So I don't know if that's really helped anyone, to be honest with you. In fact, it's been really brain-breaking to try and get my way through trying to understand this. Like I said, I didn't want to make this a proper, absolutely in-depth analysis of all of the terms of these things. What I was trying to understand is more why we've been funneled off into our views of it, and how the situation that we're in has manipulated that. And that while we remain in this position, in this situation in society, things like this are only going to get worse. I mean, that's clear to me. You don't make any inner peace with any of these resolutions while still basically under house arrest. That's not really how it works, as far as I can see. So I have very great worries for the next year that are way beyond my worries as a musician or an artist or anything like that. But then again, I'm also, as I've said, willing to accept that it is just a fumbling in the dark through a health crisis, and that in 3 months we pop out the other side and everybody can move back into the lives they once had. Now, as I said, and I've said many times before, I kind of fail to see that happening, but who knows? And that's the thing. The situation we're in looks like all things at the same time. I don't have the answers, my friends. I'm just a singer in a heavy metal band. I know that was a kind of unfocused ramble through some thoughts, and that's just the way this January has been. I'll try and get into some more precise, concise episodes in the future. But it's been difficult. It's been difficult to keep on track. But I do have some cool guests coming up, and that's going to be something more in the future. But like I said, just trying to hold the line with sanity. Try and not fall down either side of the ravine. Try and prize rationality and debate and all of those things whenever you can. Because otherwise we're pretty doomed if we're going to just always listen to the polarized voices from either side. That's it, isn't it, eh? So stay fit, stay strong, and don't let the bastards grind you down. Agitators Anonymous, episode 41.